Okay, we should get started. My name is Peter Andreas. I'm the interim director here at the Watson Institute for International Studies. Welcome for coming, especially on this beautiful day. I'm actually going to hand things over fairly quickly to my colleague, Mark Blythe. But before, I wanted to just give a few words of welcome, since this is actually, I believe, the first public welcoming of Rick Locke, who is not only the author of the book that we are going to talk about today, but most importantly is the incoming director of the Watson Institute for International Studies starting in July. And I can assure you that even though his job officially starts July 1st, it really started January 1st. And so it's not even premature to have a book event for him now, because he actually is virtually full-time faculty at Watson, pro bono, I should say, lent from MIT. When I heard about this book coming out, we've actually done a series of book launch events this year, but when I heard about this book coming out, I immediately asked Rick, should we do it now, or should we wait till you arrive in the fall? And fortunately, he said, hey, let's do it sooner rather than later. So I'm thrilled to be able to do this literally hot off the press. And here's the book. In fact, interestingly enough, I have 3 versions of the book. The first version, which is the cheapest, but the most rare, is the bound page proofs, which I received a little while ago. And it's a very good book. The second version of the book is a typical Cambridge Studies and Comparative Politics book, which is a beautiful book, hardbound, which in Cambridge Press, by the way, is the premier first-tiered press in political science, and the Cambridge series in Comparative Politics is the most prestigious series in comparative politics you can publish in. So having said that, for many people, it means their tenure book, and they publish it and it's $90, $80. So Rick obviously is not in that situation. So Rick has this book, which is library bound, but he also has the paperback version, which came out at the same time, and I would urge you all to buy the paperback version. It is much less expensive, and in fact, it's quite reasonably priced, especially
and there will be an ebook
on Amazon, maybe an ebook, exactly.
There is an ebook.
So Mark's actually going to do all the introductions, but just to tell you formally about Rick, he's the Deputy Dean of the Sloan School of Management, head of the Political Science Department there. And again, most importantly, he is our incoming new director. So Mark, the floor is yours.
It seems only a week ago I was standing here talking about another book, but that's an entirely different thing. So I've actually known Rick Locke, sort of perhaps the best word is inadvertently as well as in any other way, for about 20 years. Because the weird thing about scholarship, of course, is you know people through their work long before you ever get a chance to meet them, or you meet them and it's like, oh, you're that person. You know, that's kind of the way it works. So in a former life before Watson, because he did have a life before Watson, Rick Locke was a scholar of comparative political economy with a specialism in European politics. His early work grabbed the attention of the discipline by combining very rigorous field research, especially a very nuanced attention to individual unions and firms and how they collaborate and cooperate and also have conflicts with each other, with very powerful theoretical contributions. His first book, Remaking the Italian Economy, confronted the puzzle of northern industrial success. Now I want to stop for a minute and just think about that sentence, northern industrial success, because first of all, despite what you read in the papers, Italy is not actually an industrial basket case. It may have awful governance structures, rent-seeking on a truly operatic scale, terrible demographics, all of which have resulted in 2 decades of low growth and the accumulation of a large amount of government debt. But despite that, northern Italy is one of the world's leading industrial exporters. Moreover, these globally competitive, relatively small firms have managed to upgrade and grow while dealing with rather aggressive, even politically radical trade unions. So what Rick was able to do was explore and unpack the nature of the success. And he predicted, back in the day when he published this book, that it would continue, which it did, despite the efforts of the Italian political classes to drag it down and drown it in the bathtub. Remaking the Italian economy was a significant contribution to scholarship, and it was also a precursor of something that's become very well known in political science. I see it as one of the foundational contributions to, before the term was called, the body of work known as historical institutions. institutionalism. Now, I mention all that to put this book in context, because you would think that you couldn't get anything more different, right? Labour rights in the global economy, global supply chains, whatever. But I think there's actually a very strong continuity between these two works that isn't immediately apparent, but if you think about it for a minute, I think it's there. So fast forward to today, and Rick Locke's continuing work on firms in the global economy, which is this common element, has come together in this highly anticipated volume with Cambridge, promoting labour rights in the global economy. Now, the book we're going to hear about today from Rick very shortly is based on a simply astonishing data set. The fact that it's astonishing is twofold. Number one, that he was able to put it together, and number two, the number of hours needed to put this together, because it's absolutely huge. Rick and his collaborators, mainly his legion of graduate students, examined a decade of independent company labour audits and information from NGOs on labour compliance in firms that were part of sort of disaggregated global supply chains. And the book that comes out of this is, I really mean this, a seminal analysis of one of the most important questions in the political economy of labour, now that we talk about globalised rather than national labour markets, which is who can best improve the lot of workers? Is it unions? Is it governments? Or is it, as we've seemed to have put our faith to a large extent, in well-meaning corporations? Well, what he finds is quite interesting, to say the least. There's a sincere effort by firms, very sincere sometimes, okay, it's wrapped up in self-interest, but it's a sincere effort to basically do the right thing. But it's never enough. It doesn't work on its own. And because it doesn't work on its own, if you want to improve the lot of labour at the end of the global supply chain, you're going to have to do more. And they can't do enough because they lack leverage. They lack the monitoring capacity over their suppliers, and core companies can't really sanction these subcontractor firms to make them do the right thing. So it's about building institutional capacity, but capacity is not a technocratic top-down project. It's not something you can legislate and hand down as the correct set of rules. It is ultimately, and this is why this is a work of political science, a political process. The building of institutional capacity can only be done when three forces work together: labour unions, government regulators, and the companies themselves. The message that emerged from the book is that global supply chains and the labour that makes them possible can be reformed. There can be an upskilling and upgrading, but it is ultimately a political process, which means political choices to do things or not to do things. And the job cannot be done by corporations alone, no matter how well-meaning, nor governments, no matter how tough, nor labour, no matter how militant. Instead, cooperation and capacity building go together in moments of conflict to push forward labour's lot in the global economy. Now, what does this have to do with the industrial districts of Italy? And here's where I see a very nice symmetry. There, he argued that local institutional solutions fought out between business and labour had the aggregate and macro effect of improving the industrial profile of an entire region. The micropolitics improved the macro outcomes, even though there was no grand plan to make that happen. Here he argues a kind of inverse but similar proposition, that macro outcomes can be improved by engaging in a deliberate micropolitics amongst these very different actors. And only when that explicitly political understanding is actualized do we really get the improvements that we seek. The politics from the bottom drives the macro outcomes on the top. Given this, I think that there is an essential similarity and a continuity in this work. And it's a very, very important book, but it's also a very important way of looking at the world, because it reminds us of something very important, that when you're talking about firms and when you're talking about labour and all the things that go into it that seem to be so abstract, it's politics all the way through. And this is a first-class work of political science. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and for hosting this event. It's great to be here, and I am delighted to be able to say that I'll be joining you in the summer. Thank you both, Peter and Mark, for those wonderful introductory remarks. I was asked to speak briefly about the book, the key findings and its policy implications. But before I do that, I wanted to explain a little bit the motivation and the context behind the work, just to sort of get a sense of why I do the work that I do with a wonderful group of graduate students. So context. Last week, in an industrial suburb of Dhaka, Bangladesh, a building housing various garment factories collapsed. So far, we know that over 400 people have been reported dead as a result of this terrible industrial accident, but some estimate that the numbers can climb up to over 1,000 people. Most of these are young women who were basically at their sewing stations. And what's particularly striking about this particular event that's in the news every day for the last week, is that the cracks in the building were reported the day before. And they were reported on the evening news. I mean, so everyone knew that this was happening, and it was also reported to the police, who told the owner of the building to shut it down, but who refused to shut it down and insisted that the building was okay and that the factories could operate. And what was particularly heinous about this event was that the following morning, the workers, seeing these incredible cracks in the concrete, milling around outside of the factory, fearful of going into the factory building, basically were being threatened by factory owners and their security forces, either with sticks or by bullhorns, et cetera, basically saying you have to report back to work, there's nothing to worry about, because if you don't, you may lose your job. And so as a result, these workers, feeling that they didn't have the rights to refuse, reported to work, started their shift, and shortly thereafter the building collapsed and killed them. Now, the collapse of this particular factory building in Savar, Bangladesh, this industrial suburb outside of Dhaka, follows the November factory fire in Dhaka that killed 117 people, that follows a previous fire that happened in September that killed other people, and that follows accidents like this that happen in all of the countries that host global supply chain factories, whether in Pakistan or in India or in Bangladesh or in Vietnam or China, Brazil. These are things that happen all the time. Just think about last year, the big scandal. The big scandal was Apple and the workers at Foxconn, where 24 workers took their lives because they couldn't take the pressure of working in the Foxconn factory. And so what my work seeks to do is to try to understand what we can do to put an end to these tragedies. Now, not only these kind of high-profile tragedies, which we read about every now and then, but actually the much less spectacular tragedies that happen every single day in these workplaces, where these workers are asked to work extremely long hours for very low pay at very hazardous conditions. We don't hear about those sort of series of perhaps minor injustices, but they're as pernicious as the other ones that happen all the time. And so what I try to do in my work is both understand in an analytical way what's going on in these work sites, and then try to figure out what, if anything, we can do about it. So it has both a kind of analytical research basis, but it also is driven by a normative concern, which I just think it's not right to do this to people who make the kinds of goods that we buy every single day. Now, before I began studying global supply chains and labor standards within it, as Mark said, I was a student of labor politics and political economy in Western Europe and the United States. And I studied Italy, but I also did some work in the United States on labor markets as well. And I came to think, as a result of that work, that in the world that we live in, a world of globalization, of deregulation, of more limited capabilities of individual nation states, that perhaps in this world of regulatory void, where the individual nation states don't have the capabilities, the funding, the sometimes even authority to go and regulate workplaces, health and safety conditions, or in this case, building codes, that may be an alternative. A private, voluntary regulatory system could come and fill this void. And this private, voluntary regulatory system, by the way, is not just something that companies do. It's not just a corporation-based system, but is actually what NGOs do. And so what's interesting is sometimes people see these companies and NGOs or even international organizations as working against purposes, but actually they're all on the same page when it comes to trying to develop alternatives to traditional state regulation. And I had come to believe, especially studying advanced industrial nations and what was going on with the nation state and what was happening to the reach of these nation states, let alone the capability and funding as a result of globalization, that maybe this private alternative could solve the problems. And it wasn't just me. There's a whole bunch of people who've been working on these issues. And so to test that hope, that maybe we could still regulate what we needed to regulate, even if the traditional forms, the unions were going down, the states were limited to keep it, maybe we could do it this other way. And so to test it, I began working with a terrific group of graduate students at MIT for several years to basically evaluate private compliance programs, but also capability building programs, and also private-public partnerships. And so we looked at company-based programs, we looked at NGO-based programs, we looked at programs that were sponsored by the ILO, and sometimes sponsored even by individual nation states collaborating with these other groups. And let me just tell you a little bit about the research, because I think it's important. So the basis of the data, of these data, were these audit reports that companies have. So all these companies, global brands, but also the NGOs, they basically either do their own factory auditing, sort of inspections, or they hire either other companies to do it or nonprofits to do it. And what I was able to do is convince these companies to share with me all of these audit reports. Now, these audit reports are usually sort of, multi-page documents. They have like 80 or 100 items in there, and they're checkoff lists. It's almost like a financial audit that's been adapted to this reality. And what they do is they go into the factory and they say, are there any kids here? Are the lights working? Is the fire escape, sort of blocked or not blocked? They look at payroll records. They, look at time clocks. If there's a clinic, they go to the clinic to see, how many sort of puncture wounds were there, for the sewing, and also when did it happen, to make sure that they were obeying overtime laws. And these audit reports are not nicely organized in spreadsheets. And so what had to happen is we had to basically accumulate hundreds and hundreds of these documents and code them to basically try to take out data from them. So that was extremely labor intensive. I remember for the first project, Nike, so Nike has 900 of these factory suppliers located in 50 different countries. And we had data from beginning in 1998 until 2011, so it took months to accumulate and try to sort of organize those. And so that was the thing that we were going to look at, are conditions good or bad based on companies' own data, right? So it wasn't us having to impute these things. Let's see what they said. And then what we also did is we got the sourcing data. And the sourcing data is interesting because this is what the business people use. And it basically says who owns the factories, where are they located, how big are they, how old are they, what do they make, who do they make these products for, et cetera. So we have a lot of objective data. So we wanted to try to understand, for example, before we did any field research, is there any relationship between whether you make a T-shirt or an electronic good and the kind of working conditions? Or if you're located in Brazil as opposed to the Dominican Republic, does it matter? Or if it's owned by locals as opposed to foreigners, does it matter? So we did all those kinds of analyses. And what we saw was that there was an incredible dispersion of working conditions, right? So some places actually are pretty good working conditions, and others are quite terrible, and most are in between. And what we saw is most were kind of moving in and out of compliance. And compliance is these codes of conduct that these companies and these NGOs have, which are basically like the law of the land plus a few extra things. And based on those data analyses, what we decided to do is look, there seems to be different things going on in these countries. Let's go see what's driving it. And so what we ended up doing is doing field research, and we did something called matched pair analysis or structured comparisons, where we looked at factories in the same countries making the same goods for the same brands in factories that were of the same age, same size, same kind of ownership. But what we knew from the data, their own generated data, that conditions were good in this place and not so good in this other place, and we wanted to understand why. And so we went to 14 different countries. So we did do research in Bangladesh and India and in Vietnam, in China multiple times, in Brazil, Dominican Republic, et cetera. And in the end, we visited 120 separate factories and did over 700 interviews. And it was this combination of kind of quantitative analysis, which is pretty simple, just sort of looking at description of the statistics, what we could find out in terms of patterns, and then actually deep field research. And again, I was very lucky to be able to work with a group of graduate students who actually spoke, so I speak some languages, they spoke other languages, and we were able to do a lot of interviews. And the bottom line of this research project, which it was conceived maybe 10 years ago. The actual work took about 6 years. And I think what I discovered was that what started in hope ended in disappointment, in the sense that I continue to believe that there is a role for corporations and for NGOs in trying to promote responsibility, responsible working conditions, fair working conditions in our global economy. But I have also come to a renewed appreciation for an older idea, and that idea is that ensuring fair treatment of workers is a public responsibility. It's a responsibility of government, and how to actually bring together the continuing responsibility of private actors with the continuing need of public regulation is, I think, an interesting question that I want to explore. Let me just say just briefly what I thought the 5 key findings were of the research, and then I'll turn it over to the commenters. I think that there were 5 basic conclusions to the research that we did. The first is that this alternative model of private voluntary regulation, which is a system in which companies or NGOs develop a code of conduct, and as I said, the code of conduct is usually the law of the local land plus a few extra things, and then after they develop a code of conduct, they get their suppliers to sign on to it, and then they have an army of inspectors, of auditors, sometimes their own staff, other times private companies doing it, sometimes NGOs doing it, and they go and inspect these factories to see if they're in compliance with the code of conduct. And the argument is that if they are in compliance, you continue working with them, and if they're not in compliance, you either scale back your orders or you stop working with them. I mean, that's the logic of this model, based on information and inspection and things like that. And based on a study of different supply chains, of Nike, of Hewlett-Packard, of Coca-Cola, Philips Van Heusen, doing another now project with Li and Feng, which is a big trader for Walmart, et cetera, is that after looking at all these different systems in different industries in different countries, I think I'm pretty convinced that this system, while it's better than nothing, has very limited impact. Limited impact in the sense that it does not, in and of itself, deliver significant and sustainable improvements in working conditions. Sometimes things get better, but often what you see is they get a little better before the inspection and then they fall back afterwards. So that's the first finding, which I think is important, right? And it's based on companies' own data. So what I thought was interesting about this, it wasn't like us, cooking the data. I remember the first time we did the study of Nike, and people said, "Oh, you're using their data. Don't you think it's cooked? Maybe they're only showing you favorable things." And the data showed incredibly terrible things. And I said, "Well, maybe they're cooking it, but if they're cooking it, it's not that well cooked, because look what their own data are showing." And the same was true for others. So that's the first finding. The second thing that we found, though, and this is why field research is so important, is that there was this alternative model. And this alternative model is what we call a capability building model. And that is where you try to make improvements in the factories not by policing them in a private way, but actually by trying to develop the capabilities of the managers and the factories to run both efficient and ethical factories. In other words, when you go to these factories, you realize that many of the managers of these factories were people who were like really good workers in their home country, say Taiwan, and then they got promoted to be supervisors of a line, and then maybe a factory manager, and then the Taiwanese company decided to open a plant in either Vietnam or Honduras or something like that, and they sent their good worker, supervisor, now local manager to these places, and they are just like good workers, but they've never been trained in operations management or personnel management or supply chain management or any of the basics. And so the way that they try to run their factory is by basically have the people work extremely long hours and try to, basically shave off as much as they can around salary, because that's how they think that is the only way they can make profits. And especially given that brands are pushing them in a big way. But when you can actually train these managers to run more efficient and effective operations, you see their margins go up, and under certain conditions, and I'll explain those in a minute, those margins are translated into better wages and better working conditions. And by the way, this alternative model, capability building, is sometimes done by the same people doing the private auditing. They're doing it, but they're doing it kind of under the radar. They're like filling out the checkbox. It doesn't mean anything, but they're kind of helping these factories improve their conditions. We did a fair amount of work to show that this actually has tremendous amount of promise, and it doesn't cost more. So what's interesting is that one can lead to really significant and sustained improvements, but through a different mechanism that's based on information sharing, trust building, collaboration, root cause analysis, capability building, as opposed to us versus them, threats, policing, et cetera. It's a very different kind of logic of the relationship. But just doing this kind of capability building isn't enough, because it's not merely a technocratic experience. It's not like, let me buy the software, put it in, and everything's going to be okay, or let me do the training and everything will be okay, because those increased margins that those factories can now generate have to be distributed. And how those get distributed is a fundamentally political question. Sometimes what it means is that you increase the margins or you lower the unit costs, and the brand itself captures the gains. You see that a lot in electronics, right? So therefore, you can buy the Apple, iPhone a little bit cheaper, or they just make more money off every unit. Other times, they share that margin with the supplier themselves, so that the owner of the factory can have greater profits. And sometimes you actually see that those increased margins are distributed. Some go to workers and working conditions, others go to the profits of the factory, and others are held by the brands or the large retailers are doing it. So we have to pay attention to these distributional issues, which are fundamentally political issues, and not just simply think, and I say this as someone who comes from MIT, that it's just like an engineering issue and we can figure it out. All right. The fourth finding is that we can't just look at the factories. So think about all the news about these factory complaints, the collapse that happened last week. Everyone focuses on the factory itself, the conditions of the factory, the building itself, who owns it, et cetera. And we all, as scholars, but also as policy inclined people, have always been focusing on the factory because that's where that's where you actually identify the problems. That's where the excess working conditions and the poor wages and bad and other bad things are happening in terms of labor standards. But often what's driving those conditions aren't just what's happening in factories. What's driving it is a set of practices upstream in the business by the brands or the large retailers, et cetera. So let me just give you an example. The average life cycle of a product like this is 9 months, right? 4 large retailers control 75% of the market of these kinds of products in the United States. Because of the small life cycle, no one wants to hold inventory. None of these large retailers will hold a lot of inventory. They'll just hold a little, and then if it sells more, they'll place an order. As a result, they won't buy a lot from the brands. We're not talking about Apple. Apple has its own retail, but like HP or something like that. So the brands, they won't buy a lot from the brands. The brands, therefore, aren't going to make a lot of the final product because they don't want to be stuck with something that's not going to be selling, or especially if it's no longer viable in a few more months. And so what they have done is basically created a whole system in which they wait to get point-of-sale data, which they're getting with the barcode scanning, to figure out what products are selling and what aren't selling. And then once they see this, they at the very last moment say, make me 20,000 of this. And what they've done is they've changed production architecture in such a way that the same basically components that go into this, some of them or most of them can go into the iPad or AirBook or something like that. I mean, not exactly this, but certainly iPad and AirBook, et cetera. And so what happens is all of these common components are parked right next to the factory. By the way, the same thing is for garments, the same thing is for shoes, the same thing is for other products. And they wait to the very last moment to have the order, and you can trace those orders. And what you can see is wild fluctuations of orders. And then you can literally track wild fluctuations of excess work hours and wild fluctuations of the hiring and firing of migrant workers, often young women like the ones that unfortunately died last week in Dhaka. And so what's interesting is it's not like some evil manager doing this. It's because of a set of business practices upstream that they all launch the new products at the same time. No one wants to hold inventory. They try to have shorter lead times from one year to the next, lower unit price from one year to the next. Those kinds of pressures in the end aren't being suffered. It's not like the brands are suffering, they've just passed it on. The supply chain, again, my colleagues at MIT have figured out all sorts of wonderful algorithms to sort of smooth out those supply chains. It's basically the costs of that are being borne by the workers at the final point of assembly. And that's what's driving a lot of it. So if we want to fix things, we have to fix not just the factory, but we also have to try to fix things like market forecasting, product development design, the kinds of purchasing order and lead times. And by the way, that's eminently fixable. And that's fixable in our own borders, which is, I think, an interesting conversation. It's a way of expanding a discussion of ethical consumption away from just certifying, say, organic cotton and coffee to thinking about, do we really need this the day that it comes out? Do we really need 20 T-shirts for the cost of 10? And how do we educate ourselves for these consequences? And I guess the last finding of this research, and then I'll stop, is that the state continues to play a very central role. in the governance, not just of labor rights, but of health and safety, of environment, and all sorts of other issues. It's only the state that can actually enforce several labor rights. So for example, that capability building story that I told you, you can imagine why factories or brands might invest in improving the efficiencies of these operations because they're going to get some money back, right? So that can be a win-win situation. But it's hard for me to imagine what the business case would be for why you would encourage the organization of independent unions who can actually serve as a counterforce to whatever you want to do. But that's a right in many countries, and that's a citizenship right, that can only be enforced by the state. And by the way, it cannot be enforced one factory at a time, or one company at a time, or even a supply chain at a time. It can only be enforced in the national territory. And so what's interesting in the last finding is that what I started off thinking is that maybe in this new world we can have these alternatives to the old world of traditional regulation. And I came around thinking actually we still need some of that old world of regulation, but not exactly the old world, but perhaps new forms of interaction between private and public, nonprofit and private, and trying to engage in a mutual learning system that can make regulation across a whole set of different issues more effective. And that's where I want to go with my work in the future, and I look forward to collaborating with all of you in this next endeavor. Thank you very much.
We're lucky enough to have two excellent discussants with us. We have Professor Charles Sable from Columbia University and Professor Margaret Levy from University of Washington. I believe that she's going to go first.
And the University of Sydney.
And the University of Sydney, which is obviously a bit more sunny than the University of Washington.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Okay, I feel like a very proud mother right now. For two reasons. One, Peter, thank you for your nice words about this series that I've been editing for nearly more than a decade now. So I'm very proud of Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics. But I'm also I feel very motherly, maternal towards Rick, who I've known for a long time. I think since he was a grad student and I was already a faculty member. But I've also worked very closely with him on this book, so read Mom as nudge. Okay. I've nudged him a lot about this book to help him transform this remarkable piece of research that he did into a book that speaks not only to the corporations and to the government regulators and policymakers, but also to the social science audience. And I think it really has succeeded at that. I publish a lot of wonderful books in Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics, and at least two of the authors are here. I'm not going to mention their names just because there might be a third or fourth that I'm not noticing. Two authors in addition to Rick. And hopefully there's some prospective authors in the audience, and I look forward to talking to you afterwards. Many of the books in the series win prizes. Many are books that would not otherwise be published, and I'm often very proud of those because they have a very limited audience, but they're very important for advancing social science and for our understanding of something very important in the world. But I would say that there are few, if any, books I'm more proud of than Rick's. So why is that? Well, obviously there are personal reasons, because he's such a great scholar, he's a great friend, and he's a great mensch. I think it's important to know that the work that he's done is not only reflected in the book, or in the Boston Review piece that just came out, and the celebration of the book, and the work that the book represents, and the causes. Do you just raise it up so people could see it?
The Boston Review.
It just came out today. So it's a discussion of some of the ideas in the book. But what really motivated Rick and continues to motivate Rick is a real commitment, a very strong normative as well as empirical commitment to advancing labor rights and fair and justice, social justice for workers around the world. And in that process, he has not only written this book and engaged in various kinds of public debates, but with Josh Cohn and others, Chuck Sable, He's created, and I'm part of this, he's created something called the Just Supply Chains, which has brought together people in corporations, people in active NGOs, and people in the academic world, and created a space where discussions can go on that are not about the particular fight around Adidas, which I know has been finally won, and Brown finally got behind that. Thank you. So it's not just about those conflicts, but it's a space where we can really talk about how to solve these problems, to sort of confront them and think about possible solutions. That in itself, the Just Supply Chains, I think, is a major contribution to advancing our capacity to solve these very difficult problems. Another reason I'm so proud of this book and of Rick for writing it is its relevance. He's already given you some stories about what's going, and I'm sure you're all aware of them, of things that are happening right this moment in the world, dreadful disasters, dreadful problems around the system that the brands have helped to create and to continue to sustain. There's not just the low road situation in Bangladesh, which he described. There's also the high road Chinese situation, which has increasingly moved from the low road to factories that probably won't fall down around people's ears, that do have exits that are clean, but people throw themselves off the roof because the work is so bad. Read Fordism redeveloped, redefined in a new world with very monotonous, automated work that just literally drives people crazy, even if they're relatively well paid, even if they're relatively safe compared to the alternatives. So what Rick presents is sort of a pox on both their houses, but different poxes. So he's able to begin to sort out what's the difference between these different kinds of value chains, supply chains. What's going on here, to think about the context, to think about how we might actually start to deal with these questions in the very different political and social contexts in which they exist, as well as the different kinds of economic situations that they create. One of the things that's really great about the book, and maybe the greatest thing about the book, is the good science that is in it. I mean, this is extraordinary science. Social science, science, I don't care what we call it. He's described the data. This is, as Charles Tilley has said, there are cases of hard-won data, and this is one of them. I mean, who else has been able to get this kind of data out of these firms? And he refused any, even though he was doing research that might in fact benefit Nike and Hewlett-Packard and the other companies, Phillips Van Heusen, that are in the book. He didn't take any money for that. He gave them some advice, but he was able to convince them that it was in their interest and in the interest of all of us to get inside those firms and get this data. And then he analyzed it with this team of students, yes, but they did a remarkable job of analyzing it. And they did it in a way that when I introduced Rick in one of our battles against Nike, we brought Rick out there to the University of Washington to help us convince the president and the provost to end our contract with Nike, and we in fact did threaten that to Nike. We did ultimately win that campaign, but we brought Rick out there, and he met with the provost of the University of Washington, who was trying to decide whether or not to be on the Nike board. And she came and listened to his talk, and she's a biologist. And she was really impressed. I think he did more for social science, let alone for supply chains, on that day at the University of Washington, because she suddenly saw that a social scientist could actually do something like they could actually do this. He was looking at these two kinds of firms in two different places. He had the context all controlled. She could actually make sense of it as a scientist. And frankly, most of the social science talks she went to, she couldn't make sense of. But this one she could. So the data is unbelievable, and the analysis of it is just first rate. He's also respectful of all parties in these situations. This is not a Manichaean account. There isn't a totally good and a totally bad, though obviously many of our sympathies lie with one group of actors more than another. But in order to make change happen, we have to recognize, as Mark noted in his opening remarks, that often these firms are quite well-intentioned, at least the brands, that they're often trying to correct the problems that are in their supply chains, and we've got to recognize that and work with it if we're going to actually make change happen. Often governments, at least some of the actors in government, are actually trying to fix the situation, so we've got to recognize that and work with it. So what I really love about this book is the normative commitments combined with the hard-headed empirical research to tell us what is really going on, what is possible, what is not, where the paths are that we might take. So it's a real effort to use high-quality analysis and research to promote better policy and better practice. Does it fully, I'm a political scientist, I'm going to now give a few critiques, because I think there's a lot more to do, as Rick himself suggested, and as I hope he encourages during his period here at Watson. Does the book fully succeed at all of its goals? Not fully. At least not the last goal of really informing us fully about how to engage in better practice and policy. But not for a lack of good faith effort or good effort. The problem is the complexity, the incredible complexity that Rick fully recognizes throughout the book. There are no simple answers. There's no one size fits all. There's no one answer that you get for this moment that will sustain itself over time. We're playing with actors here who have strong profit motives, who are going to keep trying to find ways around the regulations that restrain them. Government actors who may be corrupt in situations where they see benefits from behaving differently than what would be in the public interest. They don't even need to be corrupt. Look at our Congress. They just need to be working on some interest level that is not necessarily in the public good. So, I think those issues are tractable, but they haven't been totally, I'm not sure what the right word is here, but they certainly haven't been, not tracted, but certainly not totally solved. And so I think there's a lot more work to do to think about how you get incentives aligned. And Rick has started us on that path, but we know that the laws on the books are often there, but not fully enforced. Bangladesh is an excellent example of that. It has the laws. You're not supposed to put workers into factories that are basically condemnable properties, but that happens all the time. Complaints are made and nothing happens. Okay, so one of the issues that we still really have to look at is how to align interest, how to get government to actually enforce the rules that are in the books, how to get these collaborative processes to be sustainable, not just happen at one moment in time. And I think there's another issue, and I'll end with that I think also deserves, one of many other issues that deserves additional attention. We were actually talking about this in the car on the way here, which is part of what drives this whole process. Rick talked about the low amount of inventory that some company, a retailer will keep on their shelves. But that's driven by consumer demand. That's driven by our desire to have the latest iPhone, the coolest new dress, whatever it is, that the high fashion, quick turnover, we've got to have lots of stuff, and it's got to be cheap, and it's got to be beautiful, and it's got to be right. And so we're pushing that. The consumer demand for high fashion, trendy, cheap goods is what's one of the major things pushing this whole process. It's what the brands build themselves on. And what do we know about that process? What do we know about what goes into the mentality of consumers? I'm looking at Rose because maybe she can help us here. How do we think about the psychology of consumption? What do we actually know about what creates a certain kind of consumer taste? Now, we have some hints. Michael Hiscox and Jens Heinmuller have been doing some very interesting work, experimental work, on consumer practices, and that creates some advance, and I'm just naming them, but there are others doing research in that area. We have some incredible historical accounts, Dana Frank's work on consumerism. Liz Cohn's fabulous book on the Consumer Republic, and that, again, gives us some hints, and they're historians, but they're very political historians. They're thinking about the politics of that. But we still have a lot more work to do there. These are political questions, social questions, psychological questions. They're researchable questions, and we should be researching them and finding answers to them. So all that being said, Rick hasn't solved all the problems of the world. But his book and his work as an advocate of labor rights significantly has advanced and advances brand responsibility and our collective capacity to prevent, or at least inhibit, some of the predatory practices and dreadful disasters that have beset the world of brand irresponsibility. Thank you. My latest Apple product, of course.
Hi. Let me first associate myself with the Rick's statement of the moral commitment that informs the book. I guess in a room like this, that doesn't need to be explained. The more intensely it's felt, the more important it is to understand that one of the messages of the book is that how exactly you respond to that moral commitment is at least as important as having it in the first place. This is a book about trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work in the face of situations that many people will say are obviously of moral concern. If you, on the other hand, stray in off the street and don't share these moral concerns, then you should read the book, and because, for example, you think markets just produce outcomes that are good across the board for people at the bottom of a production system and for developing countries, any belief in that automaticity would be at least shaken by reading the book. So no matter what, you should read the book. I want to actually say that the book is, keep in mind the Rick, I guess, are you, I say Ricky, and is it Rick here? I don't want to get people
You can say whatever you want.
confused. Okay, so I'm going to, it's Ricky to me. Keep in mind his 5 findings. Nothing I'm going to say is going to impugn those findings. They follow from what's in the book. But I want to suggest that what's in the book is, if anything, more disconcerting intellectually and invites or requires greater reflection about policy and politics than some of the things that were said, with the exception of what Rick said about the agenda for going forward. So to see what I have in mind, I want to quickly review the findings of the book from a point of view that's analytic, but designed to highlight what's really disruptive about it. So let's just say that the book, it's testing using the self-generated data by firms in their efforts to improve their performance on a bunch of these morally relevant, politically relevant metrics. It's testing 3, or it'll turn out to be three with some subscripts, ideas about what works to redirect complex production systems. So one is just the idea of coercion and compliance, and as incentive system where the penalty for violation is the deterrence, and if you set the penalties right, you get the outcome. And that's basically the system that was constructed. So people think we're going to have inspectors, we're going to have a set of standards that impose rules, and we're going to have inspectors go check, and there will be a penalty, which is the withdrawal of the firm's business, And if all of those things are said appropriately, will deter the bad behavior that we want to reduce and eventually eliminate. And that's a very straightforward expectation. And it plainly on the self-generated data does not work. It doesn't work. Now, should we have expected it to work? I mean, if you look at other, what's the record of I teach at a law school, so there are, criminologists who think that's, so people have tested this and it never works. It basically never works because you have to have the penalty is infinitely high, or a system that is guaranteed to catch everybody and effectively prosecute everybody. And if you have the incentives high enough, the penalty is high enough so that to take account of the fact that you can't catch every violator and can't punish everyone you catch, then of course you're unfair to the few people that you do catch, because what they did is not worthy of an infinite penalty. So there's an infinite amount. Anyone who would look would see in a minute that these kinds of deterrence systems don't work in simple cases. They don't even work. They don't even work in assigning letter grades to restaurants. You would think that if there's a situation where it would work, it's you have an inspector goes into the restaurant, says that's an A or B or a C. The letter goes up. It doesn't work because it turns out that a restaurant operates continuously. And what you really need is continuous monitoring of the restaurant. If you know when you can game the monitoring, and people have done very careful studies to show you that the grade you get in one period has no relation to the grade you get in the next period, basically. So the systems, even the simplest ones, are fraught. The interesting fact here is not that this was, kind of plainly not going to work, but that NGOs and very thoughtful, impassioned people in the late 1990s, I know it's another century, but it's, as in the human, not geologic, in the human timescale, it's not that. That's what they thought was needed. And you have to keep that in mind, because when we come back to the idea that Rick says again, that the state has a role to play, part of you must bear in mind that part of the reason that people did massively and for more than a decade, something that no one could have really thought on reflection would have a chance of success, is because it is a deeply ingrained reflex that is the way the state intervenes. If you're serious, that's how you have the state intervene. And in fact, what people did was build a better private labor inspection system than almost any labor inspection system anywhere in the developed world, let alone the underdeveloped, less developing world. It's intellectually, in a sense, trivial, and that says something bad about triviality, because it's actually deeply revealing about a trope, and we don't want to. For the reason we care about this, we don't want to make that mistake again. Okay, there's a second model that's actually disconfirmed in the book, which is also that's troubling. If you think, okay, we need the state and we have a reflex for what state action is, we just saw what it is, and it produces futility. Then we need an alternative idea of what's effective state action. We'll come back to it. The second model is a commitment model. Okay, it's in the book very clearly. It's not it occurs in different places. It's not given a separate chapter. A commitment model is, on the analogy of marriage, or marriage in the pre-post modern form of marriage. So marriage where the idea of commitment is and I guess this typically the ideas that have not so vital in everyday life nonetheless live on in academic life as in the form of the different ideas about how you get you generate trust. And one of the key ideas is that in places not the United States, but in other places, people make a long-term commitment to each other, and having made the commitment, which is irrevocable, they're then obligated to adjust to one another, to learn together, to accommodate the situations that they now jointly face through the commitment. And it's the commitment which generates the adaptability. So the book is actually quite devastating because there's a straightforward prediction, which is firms that make or have long-term relations with their suppliers should they should do, especially if there's a joint commitment to improving labor standards, they should do better. And they don't do better. In fact, often they do worse. They actually do worse. And you can think of reasons why they would do worse, but because somebody has to do this, it's the person, okay, but they for sure don't do better. But one of the standard recommendations for building trust is to make these commitments. And where they have been made, in fact, they don't systematically work. In fact, they seem to not work. They produce one of the most striking correlations. They're really not so good. So that's troubling. That our reflex to bring in the state leads to a form of compliance behavior that we know clearly fails, and that are the sort of, this is often said, Japan or Germany or countries that are now plagued by hyper-individualism of the kind that's said to affect us. They're the ones that make these commitments, and you could imagine firms, okay, that by itself doesn't work. So now there's a third model. The third model is actually, this is the capacity building model that Rick mentioned. And it's in the presentation, I want to say it's a little blurred. It's blurred, but not in a way that affects the results at all. Let me from my own point of view, let me try and de-blur it a little bit and explain why I think it's a little blurred in the presentation. Use the material in the book to just tweak it a bit, and then say that the conclusion drawn from this category turns out to be is exactly right and poses the questions that we have to address. So capacity building, there's a very interesting discussion of it in the book, and it has origins that range from development economics, where people try various forms of intervention, and they discover they can't make it work, so that in desperation they say UNDP and eventually the World Bank and many different groups converge on this. We get it. We have to build the capacity of these countries to solve their own problems. We shouldn't solve the problems for them, and we shouldn't just rely on incentive systems, conditionality, I guess is the polite word, to induce them to change their behavior in a way that will be self-sustaining and beneficial. We have to build their capacities. So that's one, and then it ranges all the way to a philosophical idea that that the San idea that we should the whole point of social action is to enable everyone, each of us, to live the life, to utilize to the full, develop and utilize to the full the capacities that we're endowed with as humans. So, in their particularity. So, people converge on this. And it's realized in a variety of different ways. Let me just tell you about two, because they play a central role. They play a central role in the book. One is a version of continuous improvement. It's a Toyota-style production, but understood very broadly. So firms, the idea is that firms put themselves in a situation where there are no buffers against mistakes. There are no inventories. So if you make a mistake, you have to identify the source of the mistake and fix it, because otherwise you can't continue producing. Okay, so that's a very simple, very general idea. And what it means is that you have to slowly rebuild the whole organization in order to solve, because each success leads eventually to, it reveals another problem. There's always something that breaks. You fix one thing, and then the next most vulnerable point in the system breaks, and eventually you keep, the continuous improvement eventually incrementally generates a complete revision of the whole system. Okay, so that's, and Rick shows us that there are a bunch of firms that actually, and in fact, whole companies that do this very systematically, really systematically. So he gives a very, there's a paired set, I'll talk about the other member of the pair in a second, in Mexico that's producing T-shirts that does this and gets higher quality and higher productivity, and the gains are shared widely. It's one of the dramatic successes in the book. It's maybe the epitome of a firm that does it right. There's another firm in the book that's described, a Honduran firm, Sula, I guess it is, that owned domestically by some Honduran group, which does exactly the same thing with the same results. And then there's a reference in the book to IKEA, which does this massively and all over in many different countries. And at one point, Rick says, I was reading along thinking, when is he going to say it? And sure enough, you say, these three firms, these three things do this. Okay, so this is an example of firms, and it's not clear what the limit is. That is, it isn't clear. These firms are plainly doing this at the level of production and and beyond. That is, in various cases, you can see that they reorganize production so that it becomes more flexible and more productive and a higher quality, and then that poses issues about overtime, and then they solve those problems by the same method, so it iterates. Okay, we don't know what the limit of that is, but it looks like if you're really serious about doing this, you go a long way. Now that looks like it's halfway between. It's not the whole solution, because you start off. There's no clear limit on it. You know that it's going to lead in some direction, but we don't know how far it's going to lead, and there's no obvious place where it stops. There's no self blockage in the system itself. That's one example of capacity building. Okay, and there's a second example, which is the other Mexican firm that's described. The twin of the close cousin of the first, making technically more demanding stuff, but in longer runs. And that firm, characteristically for this other group within the capacity building solution, finds some fiendishly clever way of getting more productivity, a little bit more flexibility, greater ability to adjust to changing market conditions, and it does that without benefiting it benefits the workers to some measure, but without there's no expansive inclusion of them in decision making. There's no sense of ample participation, and from many points of view, the factory looks like a traditional mass production factory, though through some clever production innovations, it's able to be more robust. Okay, and then we're left with the puzzle. There are both of these things. Both of them count as capacity building, and then we say, okay, so capacity building is insufficient. Okay, now the reason I say that's a little blurry is because they actually are not the same. It's not the same kind of production reorganization. They're two different. And I went and actually I read some of the footnotes just to see, and they're described as two different production models. Okay, so you could tell one of them if you walked into the factory and saw the way the machines were laid out, you could tell one of them involved greater flexibility and more worker participation, and the other less. Okay, so you wouldn't have to, you could just tell from the production setup, forget about the details. So maybe there's really a good capacity building model that works and will solve a lot of problems, and and then there's something that looks like it which we can distinguish, okay? Maybe that's true and maybe that's not. I think there's probably some truth to it. The reason it doesn't matter in the end is, it turns out that even the good model requires a massive amount of help. The firm can't get to it itself. IKEA has a whole army of people that are doing the work of supporting these firms, learning to build all these very demanding capacities. And why is IKEA doing that? Because it turns out that IKEA was a pariah among Swedish firms for cheap furniture. And they went off and they had to train and work with people in Poland to get the quality they need. So in order to reestablish themselves as a capable Swedish firm, they had to go create an army of people. That will be the exception. So even if we distinguish these two and said there's a model that is in some sense self-extending, we would still need to provide a huge amount of services of two kinds. We'd need regulatory services to limit bad behavior, and we would need technical services to provide the capacity building. Last point. How do we do that? How do we do that? If just trust me here, the one model that we actually have, the one that we really know how to do without, just wake you up in the middle of the night and say, the state's back in, do some service provision, do some regulating, you're going to do exactly what these very good people did in the late 1990s. You're going to build a compliance system, or you're going to build a service provision system of the sort which have failed. Now, that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of a new story. Rick said at the end that the task is to figure out what kind of a regulatory system, those things exist. It isn't that IKEA is doing something that only a private firm can do. It's not that food safety or nuclear safety, not Fukushima, but our own nuclear safety, or Norwegian oil field petroleum drilling, which is extremely safe. It's not that we have living, breathing examples of building the regulatory and service delivery complements to the firm developments, and what we need is Rick again to go do for those things what was done with this, what was done at the firm level. It's going to take another army. It's going to take a lot of. It's going to be a lot of data that has to be meticulously put together. It's happening. It's doable. If you believe in the commitment that drove the first piece, you'll believe in the next piece.
Thank you very much. And it would be traditional to hand over now for a response, but let's just go to questions instead because time is of the essence. I will field them, so who would like to go? Jim, you go first.
First, thank you for just a marvelous panel, really a wonderful feast for us. I've got a couple of questions for you, Rick. The first, all discussions of this book start with, how the hell did he get that data? So how the hell did you get that data? And I'm particularly interested in the kinds of conversations you had with the people who gave you the data, and the conversations with whoever didn't give you the data. There must be firms that said no, and I'd be interested in the differences. That's the question I really want to ask. Let me just sneak a couple more and you can take them or leave them. There's a kind of exotic quality to this. There's Pakistan and other countries. One's reminded of meatpacking firms in the United States. Same phenomenon, a difference of degree or a difference of kind, and is there leverage in contrasting the kinds of companies you were talking about with companies existing in what used to be called the first world? I forget what you call it now. And finally, I'd really love to hear you talk a little bit about the state. You toss the state out, you bring it back in. The comments right at the end were saying, okay, help us rethink this. I love to hear that, no, the state is still pretty important. Could you just talk a little bit about how we should be thinking about the state? And I'll tell you my bias so you can have something to go on, and that is, you can't do better than the old-fashioned state, and it's a question of training it to do no tricks. But maybe that's not it, and so I'd be really interested in hearing, tell us about the state.
Great.
So to simplify all that down, tell us about the state and who wouldn't give you the data.
So the way that that I got the data were in 2002 I wrote a case study about Nike and conceptions of corporate responsibility, and I visited a bunch of factories in China and did a lot of interviews in the headquarters. And during those interviews I heard about these audit reports, and you know, academics hear about data, they start salivating, and I thought, well, that's really great. Would you share those with us? And they were like, well, I don't know, we have to check. And it took 3 years of multiple visits and interviews with corporate counsels, vice presidents, having to send them everything I ever wrote, getting once in the mail one audit report, and saying, you know, here, we send it to you. I'm like, no, that's not what I want. But once Nike did share what they had, and part of it, I think, was their own embarrassment that what they had wasn't organized, right? They had all these reports. They had actually never systematically read them. They had read one scandalous thing and then sort of reacted to that one scandalous case, but they had never looked at it. And so the argument was, don't you want to know? But once Nike said yes, and then and they allowed us to publish the results with their name on it, then others came forward. Still, some companies, would say, forget it. One company, Apple, I visited them a number of years ago, and we were about to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So you sign these non-disclosure agreements where I can't give the names of individual factories and things like that. They get to see what we do in terms of factual accuracy, but they have no editorial control. 6 years later, Apple is now willing to share data. So things take time, and I think working in a business school was kind of safe for them. So that was one thing. I think the phenomena is not exotic; it's everywhere. What we have here is there. It's just differences, degree, and sometimes what we have here is even worse than what we see elsewhere. In terms of the role of the state, I was genuine, and I think this is something that both Chuck and Margaret brought up, is we know I think we now have a better understanding of what the private can or can't do. And by private, I mean even NGOs, so non-public authorities. I think we know a fair amount about what traditional models of state regulation can't and can't do. And I think what we want to do is start building on some of these actually well-researched experiences in the public sector and the private sector at the intersection of this kind of learning, experimentation, benchmarking, all these kinds of practices that it's interesting. You start seeing them in the private sector, but you start seeing them in the public sector, or even in the nonprofit sector. And how can we study those to understand what is in fact the role of the state or roles of the state in governance in general, and how might those roles differ in different contexts for different kinds of issues, and who can or can't partner with the state in doing it. And there wasn't a throwaway line. That's genuinely what I hope a group of us will be able to be doing here at Watson in the near future.
Basara.
So you laid out a wide range of actors. It's amazing that you can bring all these people together, from the workers and the NGOs and the international organizations and the factories, etc. But I want to ask about two extremes. One extreme would be the role of finance capital in all of this. So this is still based on a study of production, but we know that money is floating around in ways that also structures decision-making in these respects, and I was just wondering if you could touch on that a little bit, because that has a lot to do with the degree of economic sovereignty that any state would have. So you can bring the state back in, but the state today is not what it was 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. And so that's one end. The other end is this fascinating introduction, I think, by Mark about micropolitics, and I see from the book as well, in the end being where a lot of these negotiations will take place. And if all politics is local, then how do you bring in the micro-political factor to the analysis? So, for example, workers today in many of these factories, let's say this factory in Bangladesh. So the women are young, so there's a generational issue. They're unmarried, they don't have the same kind of protection. They're subject to a lot of pressure from people who organize this labor, bring it in from the countryside to the city. And then they have another layer of not just the bosses, but also the local politics and machinery at work on the local. And you can see that they're facing many, many, many layers of enemies. How can they be empowered in a way that can bring in the analysis? If that's where the game is, what role can they really play?
Those are two great questions, Bashar. I will defer detail about finance capital to Mark, but I would just say that the way that it works in this place is twofold. One is developing countries are hungry for foreign direct investment, right? One of the things that has happened in this age of globalization, especially a world dominated by global supply chains, is that finally they're able to actually have investment, which gives them not just employment, but also tax revenues. And as a result, even though they have laws on the books, they often don't enforce those laws because they're afraid that if they enforce those laws, even when they're capable of enforcing those laws, their fear is that footloose capital will go to the next place that will not enforce it. Whether or not that's true, I think is unclear. I mean, China keeps on actually increasingly enforcing laws in the book and passing laws in the book, and there's been some exodus to Vietnam or else Indonesia for some sectors, but that's also because the Chinese government wants those sectors to move on because they want to develop other sectors. So I think that's one thing. And the other dimension of finance is the corporate returns, that companies that are publicly traded are very careful about their returns, and this idea of selling more stuff at ever cheaper to increase your market share, the way that these companies, traditional companies, increase their returns is either they buy other companies, they merge, and therefore they show they have greater growth, or they squeeze to get greater growth. That's what we're seeing, and so therefore this aligning incentives point is very important. I don't actually work on financial side of things. I actually pay attention to the production side of things, but my sense is there would be an interesting dialogue. On the local politics, I think there's 2 points. One is the reason why we do comparisons, right, what comparative politics or comparative research in general, is that we want to actually know in detail what's going on in these localities, but then try to see what common patterns they are. And what's striking is, notwithstanding the particularities of any case in one factory in Mexico as opposed to Brazil, as opposed to China, was how remarkably similar these models that Chuck talked about were, and how their results were remarkably similar. And so you can sort of see these similarities across the different localities, and the dynamics that are driving them, the micropolitics, turn out to be remarkably similar. But linked to that point was something about how do you empower workers. Yeah. Which I see as somewhat different, and I think that what we see is there's different ways that workers are getting empowered. In some ways, they're being empowered simply because there is a tight labor market. So the south of China starts seeing all sorts of protests inside factories and outside of factories because suddenly there's a tight labor market. Even in China, there's a tight labor market. So the factories either move into the interior or they have to raise wages, and wages have gone up 30% in the last 2 years. And there have been all sorts of laws passed. So that's partially what's going on, and there's a generational change going on, even among migrant workers. It's very interesting to see the latest generation of migrant workers and what they're willing and not willing to do. There's very, very high turnover in these factories. So in some factories, it's like 100% turnover every 2 years. They're not going to better paid jobs. They're going into retail. Just because they feel like the rhythm of the work is different, or they have more freedoms or something. There's this great book, Factory Girls by Leslie Cheng, that documents a lot of this thing. But another way that workers are getting empowered is sometimes the state is actually finally enforcing some of the rules, or they're using vehicles available to them. So what we see is in committees of health and safety, which are non-official unions, et cetera, in places that you can't really have independent unions, you start seeing those getting used for worker voice, or in China, hometown associations and networks of people from the same village and how they protect each other. There's been a lot of good research on that. So my sense is that there is no shortage of ways to empower the workers, but they do need to be empowered institutionally for them to fully exercise their rights. And that's not anything that the capability model or the compliance model can give them.
So,
I have a question for you. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a computer scientist, so I'll try to phrase it in a way that makes sense. When I look at you describe the burdens on the worker and how volatile they are, and you said these are due largely to upstream factors. So I look at this global supply chain and say, is it a resilient system? Kanban was introduced by Japanese, right? And we brought that technology here to this country. But prior to that time, we didn't have just-in-time manufacturing. It wasn't global. And companies were able to make profits. Now, what I envision, I look at the system and I say, through technology, we've squeezed a lot of costs out, but we've also built a system that's more fragile. And if you, as a captain of industry, were to look at this system, you might say, you know, I'm making tremendous profits by doing this, but it could be an event that's unpredictable that could disrupt my supply chain, and I could lose a ton of money. And if they were educated to that point, perhaps that upstream effect would result in a better working condition for people in the factories.
That's my hope too, is that through education, one can show that it's in their own self-interest, even if it's enlightened self-interest. But John, I think you're absolutely right. I think just think about it, you know, there's Fukushima, and suddenly, you know, we have problems with Japanese goods. There's the SARS outbreak. We have, problems getting product out of China, and things like that. I think that these supply chains are in fact quite fragile. And what we're beginning to see is actually a restructuring of them, so that it's not like make anything anywhere and ship it around, because the idea was that you had cheap or ever cheaper transportation, cheaper communication, and unlimited supply of material goods and labor. None of those conditions hold. And not only that, but people are beginning to worry about carbon and concerns about carbon tax and things like that. So what you're beginning to see among some of these companies is a re-regionalization of their supply chains. So China supplies Asia, Brazil supplies the Americas, et cetera, but still actually practicing the same things. And I think what we want to try to show is, when you read those kind of management techniques, what's so interesting is a lot of these companies have picked and choose pieces. So they focused on just-in-time or inventory reduction, et cetera. But in the original plans, you always had empowerment of workers too. And you gave them a lot of discretion, because that was who was driving it. And so what you have to do is kind of bring that in, bring that back to say, if you really want this kind of system, you need to have it, but you need to have it in this way that empowers and engages workers.
Ash.
So I have another standard comparative politics question. And let me phrase it this way. This is about the nature of the polity. So if you look at nature of the polity and economic growth data, or nature of the polity and poverty reduction data, basically you can say the following: that democracies are not the fastest growers, but not the worst growers, slowest growers, they're somewhere in the middle. And on poverty reduction, they have not made the most vigorous attack on poverty, but they have not been the worst performers either. They are once again in the middle. Does democracy matter to labor welfare?
So.
That's a long-run description
Yeah.
I gave you, not the short one.
All right, so I wouldn't say, so since democracy has so many prefixes on it, but let's just imagine, what we do know is that in countries that have just use the different, Rule of Law Index or the Heritage Foundation Index, whatever you want to use, ones that look like they have proxies for strong institutions, regulatory strength and stuff like that, that's where we see the greatest performance of the private sector. And what's interesting is like some of the big good companies that do stuff are countries like Malaysia, right? So is that because they're democratic, or is that because the government bureaucracies are relatively effective, at least in the regions where these factories are? I think what we want to do is we see that there is a correlation there. What we want to understand is what's actually driving it. And so in the empirical work that's been done in Cambodia, in the Dominican Republic, in Brazil, and in elsewhere, what one sees that's doing it isn't the traditional state comes back in its stronger form, but you see the kind of experimentation that Chuck was talking about, where the labor inspectors can't do it on their own. They're trying to enforce the law, but they're trying to do it in a pro-competitive way, and so they start working with local firms, local banks, local associations, et cetera, and they kind of try to stitch together a situation that allows them to do that. Trying to understand that and what are the conditions for that, I think is very important. Fundamentally, if a democracy guarantees freedoms of voice and association, as opposed to the other extreme, right? That's why I said there's many prefixes, so we always compare democracy against authoritarianism, right? But there's lots of different kinds of democracy and stuff like that. But if what democracy does that other regimes don't do is give us voice and freedom to associate, then absolutely it's in the interests of workers to be operating in a democratic regime. Now, what I think is so interesting is how a non-democratic regime, as I was saying, the stuff that's going on in China with hometown village associations and health and safety associations, stuff like that, they're able to express voice in alternative mechanisms, and I think that's very hopeful.
We have time for one more question.
I have a question about, so maybe a decade ago, there was a lot of scholarly attention to the transnational advocacy networks and the links between consumers and workers. And I'm wondering whether that hasn't played any role in the capacity building model, or if that's dated and why it's dated.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's still a role for the transnational activist networks or NGOs, but I think it's more problematic than initially was hypothesized. A lot of it was around naming and shaming campaigns, right? That the idea was to shed the light on these bad practices and have campaigns like the ones that we have just experienced to try to put pressure, consumer pressure, on these brands to change their behavior. Now, what's interesting is that some of these transnational networks actually did do capability building. And so, for example, a lot of the work that we see that was done in the Dominican Republic to recapacitate the state was done by organizations like the Fair Labor Association and others that were actually training some of the auditors and the new inspectors to do the kind of work that they were doing. So that they weren't, bless you, that they weren't doing so much capacity building as naming and shaming, but in some cases they were doing it. I think that the interesting thing about the transnational NGO networks is what was their relationship to the local bodies. And this is where I think Gay Seidman's book, Beyond the Boycott, is so great, because she really tries to show how in certain cases they didn't only crowd out the local, but they actually packaged the message. Because what really was the leverage, and this, just think about what happened with the Adidas campaign, the real leverage wasn't us as individual consumers. The real leverage is institutional actors. It was school, it was universities, it was churches, et cetera, that actually put the real drive on that. And to sell the message to those institutions, you don't talk about what's really going on, which is like people just working many hours doing the same boring thing over and over again and being kind of sexually harassed and stuff like that. What they do is they talk about child labor, or they sort of package things where actually we're the exception, not the rule. So the message got transformed, and they crowded out the local NGOs so that they couldn't develop the capabilities to keep the thing going even after the campaign ended. And so I think what we want to try to understand is, in the same way we want to try to think, what are the capabilities for companies to run ethical operations? What are the capabilities for governments, with and without, with other actors to develop the capabilities? The same thing with the NGOs. What is their role now? not in the late 1990s, but now to try to promote just working conditions in the world.
So if I were to take this opportunity to summarize in 10 seconds everything that I've learned from this discussion in this book, it would probably be this. The state may have lost power, but it doesn't mean private actors have got it either. In which case, where did the power go? Maybe that's the next project. Thank you very much.